All right, Chapter 3, Classical Conditioning Foundations. This chapter, we're really going to focus on kind of the basics of classical conditioning and how it all got started, involving Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. Of course, each slide, of course, will have a dog on it because dogs are brilliant. But we'll talk a little bit more about how this translates directly into human behavior and the dynamics of this process, which I'm sure you have some experience with, but some of the more nuanced details of how we actually can become conditioned so quickly and so readily, I think will be new. So classical conditioning really got its start with the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. His name might ring a bell. Sorry, I had to make that joke. Anyway, he wasn't a psychologist. I'm glad that the textbook points this out really well. He was actually technically a nervist, as we spoke about in the previous chapter. He was not really involved in psychology, but had examined how the nerves function and how they create reflexes in animals. And his research was really seminal in terms of kicking off this particular field and how we can be trained to have reflexes as opposed to just innate reflexes. Interestingly enough, he's credited with this and in fact won the Nobel Prize for these findings. But ironically, there was actually a scientist in the University of Pennsylvania almost simultaneously named Edwin Whitmire, who was doing almost identical research at almost the identical time. He was actually doing this as part of a PhD dissertation. But what's interesting is, of course, history will remember Pavlov for this accomplishment and not Edwin Whitmire. So your book takes a moment to mention this, and I do as well. Part of it comes down to the idea of intellectual property and where their careers were really established or not established in the case of Edwin Whitmire at the time. But both had similar findings around the same time and should both be credited with the beginnings of classical conditioning. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, Ivan Pavlov actually won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for physiology based on his findings with the dogs. There's the Nobel Prize in the bottom right there. And what he labeled them as what he referred to as psychic secretions. He was actually measuring salivation in dogs, and he called this salivation, this reflexive salivation, psychic secretions. And they were the result of an expectation or thought of food. And he actually trained them to do so, as you know with the experiment, through the ringing of a bell. So he referred to them as psychic secretions, which is not entirely incorrect. I mean, essentially they were secretions, obviously being salivation, but in some ways it was if they could see the future or anticipated the future, and that's where the term comes from in regard to the result. What he also realized, and this is I think even more important, is the idea of association learning. The dogs in his experiment, of course, began to associate the food with the sound of the bell. The bell meant nothing to them in the grand scheme of things, but through association, they began to connect the food directly with the bell and thus have the same physical reaction to the bell as they did to food. And so this is actually a very, very important issue. Human beings show this as well. As we'll talk about in a later lecture, this is, for example, why it might be difficult to forget about an ex when you have a certain song that you guys shared together. That song now becomes associated with that person and can elicit an emotional reaction or response similar to being around that person themselves. So Wolfson and Snarsky were actually two people working in Pavlov's lab at the time of the dog studies. And what they did is they actually would study the animal by putting a certain substance in the dog's mouth, whether it be a dog food, lemon juice, or in some cases sand, to see how the dog would respond. And then to measure the amount of salivation produced. Obviously, when they're putting food in the dog's mouth, the salivation level should increase in response to the positive stimuli. But things like lemon and sand should produce a lower level of salivation if they're not food and there's no appetitive response to it. So they actually found that what happened was dogs, for example, that were in the sand condition, after several exposures of having sand put in their mouth, their salivation would be reduced simply by seeing the sand. So even a picture of the sand would produce a similar salivation response as having the sand in their mouth. And what they referred to this as is object learning. Essentially, they could see the visual feature of an object, in this case sand, and understand what the texture of it would feel like in their mouth through object learning. So it's essentially associating one feature of an object with another feature. And this may seem very simple to you, but for a dog, this is actually quite important. This is quite an interesting feature. And I bring up the lemon one, for example. If you look at that picture of a lemon, there's a good chance that if you look at that picture of a lemon, your mouth will respond as if you're tasting something sour. If you think of the taste of a lemon, you can feel your mouth start to get dry and things like this in response. Maybe your lips pucker a little bit in response to that sourness. That is object learning. Simply the picture of the lemon makes you think of the taste of the lemon itself. So let's look at that seminal study in a little bit more detail. Okay, so, and I like the title of the slide here, New Reflexes from Old. Essentially what Pavlov did was take reflexes that already existed and train the animal to have new reflexes based off those existing reflexes. So there's 4 terms I really want to make sure we're very clear on. There's 2 on this slide, and then 2 in a couple slides from now. Unconditioned stimulus, we'll start there, or US. Your textbook will refer to the US constantly in this over the course of the chapters. Essentially, this unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus is a stimuli that the animal never had to learn how to respond to. And in the picture there, the picture actually looks a bit more like dog poop than anything, but it's supposed to be dog food. So dog food is something a dog never has to learn to like. They are hardwired to like food, right? So the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned simply means not learned or didn't have to be learned. The unconditioned response, in the bottom right picture there, is the dog salivating. The dog never had to learn to salivate in response to food. It was something that was already built in, a built-in reflex, an innate reflex, if you will. So that response never had to require any learning. Thus, there is the US, the food, unconditioned stimulus, producing an unconditioned response of salivation. Pavlov knew this already existed in dogs and was simply about to build on that based on this pre-existing reflex. Human beings also do this, where our salivation is increased by the appearance of food or the potential for food, but of course it's a little bit different because we tend not to drool outside of our mouths when we get excited about food. So that's probably the reason why he used dogs instead of people. In Pavlov's original experiment, he actually paired the existing reflex, in this case the existing stimuli, with a neutral stimuli. And in this experiment that he's known for, of course, he paired it with a bell, the ringing of a bell. So essentially, bells mean nothing to dogs. They actually have no reason to respond to a bell at all unless they're trained to do so. In this case, what he would do is ring a bell that would precede the onset of feeding. So he would ring a bell, pause briefly, and then give the dog some food. After a while, the dog started to understand that that bell will almost immediately signal food afterwards, and thus it started to become paired or associated. So the neutral stimulus, a bell, became paired with a unconditioned stimulus, the food, and thus started to produce the same response, which was salivation. The picture on your slide actually has a bowl instead of a bell, but that could be the case as well. That would have been just fine. If you've ever owned a dog, you understand that they typically get very excited when you go to pick up their bowl on the understanding that you will be providing them food. In the wild, wolves don't go around the forest looking for bowls as a signal for food. Bowls mean nothing to the animal until they're trained to know that the bowl represents food, that association is built. So this is what Pavlov essentially built on in his experiment. Once the dog fully associated the sound of the bell, or in the picture here, the bowl, with the food, it became what was referred to as the conditioned stimulus. In this case, conditioned means learned. The stimuli that they learned to respond to. And as the slide indicated before, this is because it was paired with the food. So he paired a stimuli that they had to learn with a stimuli that they never had to learn, which would be the food in this case. So the learned stimuli is that paired with that, and then what he found was the conditioned response, or the learned response, would be salivation. So the ringing of the bell alone, even without a presentation of food, would cause salivation. So it was a conditioned stimulus producing a conditioned response. And the same thing could be for the dog food bowl. If you lift the dog food bowl, you have yet to put any dog food in it, and if you put the dog food bowl down empty, the dog will still be salivating and be excited, even though the bowl is empty, which is kind of a cruel trick. I don't know that I would want to do that with my own dogs. But anyway, now the bowl is sufficient to trigger the salivation response. And if you don't think you're that different from a dog, really think about how you respond to when you see the Starbucks logo, or the Chick-fil-A logo, or any other place you really like. For me, it might be Taco Bell, right? I see that and think, oh, that sounds really good. Simply seeing a logo, not even the food that they sell, but seeing the logo itself, sometimes is sufficient to cause salivation and hunger. Conditioned, unconditioned responses, but now become conditioned responses. You are conditioned to see the logo, which you associate with a type of food or drink, and now you are salivating or getting hungry at simply a logo. This is how it works in people. So just to summarize, the conditioned stimulus was the light or bell. For example, you could use either one. Pavlov used a bell, or even a bowl, as we saw in the previous pictures. The unconditioned stimulus is the food. Dogs never have to learn to like food. Conditional response, or conditioned response, is the learned salivation, so the drooling in response to just the bowl or the bell or the light. And then unconditioned response, or the UR, is the unlearned salivation, the salivation that took place without any learning. In this case, the salivation as a result of seeing the food. So make sure for this, going forward in this chapter and then going forward in this course, you're able to quickly identify the CS, US, CR, and UR. The key aspect of this is always going to be C versus U, C being learned, U being unlearned. John Watson was an American behavioral researcher who kind of took this a step further, and hopefully you'll forgive the bad language, but it's a Shakespearean reference up at the top. He actually said that he could train people to be whatever they wanted, or whatever he wanted, based on the principles of conditioning. And this is a direct quote from John Watson: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own special world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one of them at random and train him to be any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, beggar, man, and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So you hear this quote, and this is actually a very bold statement. He basically said, I can make people what I want them to be. And this is something he put into practice, actually. We'll talk about this in the next slide as well. But he truly believed that through conditioning, you can make someone, regardless of who they are as an individual, into whatever you want them to be. This is a bit extreme. Research indicates, as does experience, since this statement was made, this is not the case. There is a great deal of influence that can be placed on conditioning, but not entire. This was an overstatement, and John Watson, as you'll see in the upcoming slides, was not the most ethical individual when it came to research. So we'll discuss this a bit more as we move through here. So John Watson put his theory into practice and argued that he could train people to be afraid of anything simply by pairing a very scary stimulus with a conditional stimulus or a neutral stimulus, or even a positive stimulus, as it were. And he truly believed this is possible. He can make people fear things. As I said, he wasn't a very nice man, and he adopted a child. His name was Little Albert, is what he referred to him. He was actually pictured in the top right of the previous slide. He adopted little Albert and actually found that Albert, when he was a baby, was afraid of very loud sounds. So a very loud noise behind him would startle him, as it does with most children and adults. So what he did is he actually would let the child play with a little white lab rat, a real rat, which the child was not afraid of. And he'd pet it, and the little rat would just crawl around. And then he would make a very loud sound behind Albert to scare the child. And what he found is actually he became very quickly afraid of rats, because he associated that terrifying sound with this innocuous or conditional stimulus that was the rat, and immediately began to fear it. Almost immediately began to fear it. And what happened was they found that his fear became generalized to almost any white fluffy objects, whether they be bunnies or cotton or even Santa's beard. He actually performed this with a Santa mask and found that the white fluffiness of Santa's beard scared the heck out of the child. So he actually trained little Albert to essentially be afraid of almost the simplest of stimuli. Of course, there's some ethical concerns with this too. And ultimately, Albert was, once the experiments were done, Albert was actually given back. He and his wife gave Albert back to the adoption agency once they were done experimenting with him. So terribly unethical, not a very, very nice man at all, particularly after conditioning his child to fear things that most children are not afraid of. With regard to fear conditioning, building on the work of Watson, what they found was actually it can lead to what's called conditioned suppression. In this case, certain instincts or certain behaviors are suppressed as a result of fear. And you can see this in rabbits. I think of usually rabbits when it comes to this sort of thing. A rabbit, for example, when it is terrified of a predator, or rats do the same thing, as your slide indicates, when they're terrified of a predator or they're aware of the presence of a predator, they will typically freeze and be perfectly still as long as they can. I actually was mowing the lawn one time and came upon a bunny in our yard and was mowing, and as I mowed past it, the bunny just simply froze. Well, I got so close where I could actually touch the bunny with my foot. In fact, tried to nudge it away so it didn't get hurt, and it wouldn't move. Even when I nudged it, it saw me as a predator, and even when I, as a predator, made contact with this bunny, it refused to move because its fear conditioning was so strong it would actually condition suppression to move. So it would not move; it would simply stay frozen. Which is very common. So a lot of behaviors are suppressed when a fear conditioning is strong enough. In human beings, you might actually see a conditioned emotional response too. When we are afraid of things, regardless of context, we might scream or jump or have a particularly vigorous response to it, regardless of where we are. So you might be sitting in class, listening attentively, and you see a spider on your desk, and you might stand up and scream at the top of your lungs. You of course know that you shouldn't scream in class, but the emotional response of fear conditioning is so strong that it cannot be overwhelmed. The fear of the spider is enough to make you scream or jump in almost any context. So you can actually apply a bit of math to this idea of fear conditioning and how much it suppresses certain behaviors. So if we look at the suppression ratio there, it's conditioned responding divided by conditioned responding plus pre-CS responding. So essentially, how much were you responding to something prior to the fear conditioning, and then how much were you responding to it afterwards? As you would suspect, a suppression ratio of 0 indicates complete suppression. So at this point, you are no longer doing a certain behavior after the conditioned fear. Right? So for a bunny, this could be hopping around. It doesn't do any hopping around after the fear conditioning has taken place. It will sit perfectly still. So it's a complete suppression in that case. 0 hopping as a result of the fear. However, if the bunny hops just as much before as it did afterwards, then we're seeing a suppression ratio result of 0.5 or 1/2, however you want to look at the ratio. And in this case, this would indicate no suppression at all. The bunny is continuing on with its behavior with no change in it at all, either before or after. And so just a little bit of math to kind of back this up. I would just know these numbers in general just to get an idea of how these two components interact. Certain reflexes can be extensively useful in research. For example, the eye blink reflex. It's one of the human beings, and actually for most creatures, it's one of their more basic reflexes in that it protects the eye in light of potentially dangerous stimuli. And it's used a great deal in research on things like development, aging, and neurodegeneration. What has been found is that eye blink response actually is diminished or changed with regard to certain concerns in these areas. And what they found is that there's a high importance on the strength of a pairing between the CS and the US when eliciting a conditioned response. So, for example, one of the studies they did was they were actually pairing a tone with a puff of air to the eye. So if the tone was heard prior to the puff coming, the subject would blink right away, trying to shield the eye from the puff of air. And if you've ever had an eye exam, for example, I've got the picture at the bottom right, the eye puff, air puff machine is really unpleasant. And it will typically be preceded by a little blast of light or a little tone prior to the puff coming. But often it's very hard for us to keep our eyes open for that puff of air because of the strength of the eye blink condition. This is due to a reflex. So this reflex is actually a very good way to examine how the brain responds over the course of a period of time, and how the neural networks really build the strength of a unconditioned response, and how that connects to a conditioned response. So in some instances, we actually will be drawn towards the sign of a positive reinforcer, or the sign of the availability of a positive reinforcer, rather than the positive reinforcer itself. So this would be the human equivalent of going over and standing next to the sign at McDonald's, waiting for the food to come. We know that the sign is just indicative of the possibility or availability of a positive reinforcer, but it's not actually at the sign itself, the billboard or the big golden arches out there. We have to go inside the building, right? And it sounds kind of stupid, but this makes sense, when you consider certain types of research. Depending on how the sign is conveyed, the sign has essentially become equated with the positive stimuli. Think back to Pavlov's dogs. They're directly associated. So you might be drawn to that particular sign on the expectation that it is connected to, for example, food or sex or some other primary reinforcer. In pigeons, what they found is there was actually, the pigeon would move 3 feet away from a food dish, which for a pigeon is a pretty good distance, to peck at a light, which signaled the presentation of food, even though pecking the light was not required for food, was not required for the presentation of the food. So essentially they were going away from the source of the food in order to interact with a sign that they believed was indicative of the food coming. In this case, the sign tracking response was very strong. Human beings do this too, to some degree, but we essentially are seeking a sign to indicate availability of something. This, for example, is why if you go somewhere where you see a sign or a logo, for example, and they get there and it's closed, sign tracking indicates that the logo should indicate availability of something. And to have it not be there is a violation of our conditioned relationship, and we find that very cognitively upsetting. With classical conditioning, I think it's really easy to get caught up on, who is affected by it, comparing ourselves to animals, for example. And dogs obviously drool a great deal when they go to eat, but we don't tend to drool the same way. So it's easy to try and separate ourselves from it. But the fact of the matter is, it really actually affects us on a very, very daily basis in ways that we don't really even consider. One of the things that your textbook points out is the taste aversion versus preference. Essentially, this is an exercise of Pavlovian conditioning. So much of what you think you like or you choose to like is based on your experience with it. So, why do we like comfort foods? Things that our mom served. Well, we associate those things possibly with positive experiences with our mother. So we are conditioned to like those foods because of the positive experience we have with them. For example, by contrast, taste aversion might be a food that we don't eat because one time we ate it and got sick. In this case, we've been conditioned to associate that food with feeling sick and have very quickly learned to avoid it, whether or not the food was poisonous or had gone bad or we were allergic to it, whatever reason. We now have an aversion to that food because we've now been conditioned to dislike it. What's interesting is we actually now can override our conditioning. We understand that certain foods are nutritionally viable. So is it better for me to eat a nice green salad for lunch or to eat a big cheeseburger for lunch? Well, obviously it's healthier for me to eat a salad. But due to conditioning to things like the sugar and the salts and the flavoring in the burger, I now prefer that even though there's less nutritional value. So it's kind of an interesting situation how our preferences and aversions are lined up with what we've been conditioned to like or dislike. So with regard to taste aversion or preference, there's a couple principles that guide this. What's interesting is strong taste aversions, for example, real situations where you really, really don't like a certain food can be learned with just one pairing. So for example, I don't like olives. Let's say when I was a kid, the first time I tried olives, I got violently ill. For me, it would have been just a one and done situation. I no longer would want olives at all. I've tried it once, I got very, very ill, and now I have a serious taste aversion to olives. That would be principle one. Principle two, aversion can occur even if illness does not follow for several hours after a novel taste. What can happen here is, for example, let's say we try a new food and don't get immediately sick, right? So I try olives for the first time and don't get sick for another 4 or 5 hours. I might actually get sick for a reason different than the food. For example, I might just develop a stomach virus or something else. But now, because it is a novel taste, because I never tasted olives before, and now I'm getting sick even several hours later, I will attribute that sickness to the olives and immediately having a taste aversion to the olives and think, well, you know what, even though I didn't get sick right away, I actually got sick later, and that is what caused it. It was the olives that actually triggered the sickness. So with taste aversion, it doesn't actually have to happen immediately, but can happen even with just one single pairing. Of course, with human beings, we never move in easily predictable manners. Counterexamples to this taste aversion theory, an example I can think of is the worst I've ever gotten sick from food poisoning was from Taco Bell. And I knew it was Taco Bell because as I ate it, I thought, this doesn't taste right, but I kept eating because I'm an idiot. What was interesting is I was actually sick for 4 days after this. That's not the interesting part, but I was sick for 4 days. And even while I was sick, I would be hugging the toilet and being sick, and I would still be craving Taco Bell. Right? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If this aversion thing has any validity, I would have avoided Taco Bell forever. Interestingly enough, I didn't eat Taco Bell while I was sick, but within a week after getting so sick, I ate Taco Bell again. It doesn't make any sense because human beings have free will that can easily override our conditioning. So, counterexample, and the same thing can go for alcohol, for example. I actually worked as a bartender for 4 years while I was in graduate school and found that people who would get violently ill on a Friday night and swear off of alcohol would be back in the bar drinking again heavily on Saturday night. In this case, you should have an aversion to alcohol. You have consumed it, and you now associate it with a horrible hangover, being violently ill, right? That should cause an aversion. But interestingly enough, our free will can override this. I would say, if anything, maybe human beings have a very short-term memory for these negative pairings. And so we tend to forget how bad the alcohol made us sick when we're drinking it again, and the same thing for the food or whatever. But human beings actually don't follow these principles as perfectly as some of our animal friends. So excitatory conditioning, like the kind we saw in Pavlov's experiment, is actually dictated by a few different rules and design constructs, which we'll talk about in the next slides. Each time the CS and the US are paired, it's referred to what's called a conditioning trial. So every time the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired together, in the Pavlovian example, it would be the bell and the dog food, that is a conditioning trial. The distance or time between each of these trials is referred to as an inter-trial interval. And of course, this is very important because if you're doing the bell and the food very regularly, say every 2 minutes, the dog might actually stop being hungry and therefore not respond as vigorously to that pairing. So it's important to stagger these inter-trial intervals accordingly. And what we see too is the time between the start of the CS, so that would be the ringing of the bell, and the start of the US is referred to as the interstimulus interval, or the CS-US interval. So if you think of it from the Pavlovian example, how long between when they start ringing the bell to when they deliver the food? If it's only a few seconds, then obviously the dog will quickly pair the food with the bell. But if it's ringing the bell for half an hour and then delivering the food, the bell might not be associated with the food. And we'll talk about this actually further on the next 2 slides. With short delay excitatory conditioning, what happens is you begin the CS, so you ring the bell, right? You pause briefly, there's a short delay, and then you give the food, okay? Notice here in this case, you begin this US and then end the bell. So literally the dog, you ring the bell, say for 3 seconds, put the food down, continue to ring the bell for another 2 or 3 seconds, and then stop, right? So in this case, there's an overlap. There's a brief pause between when the bell starts and when the food is delivered, and then a brief gap between when it's delivered, and then there is a brief period where both are occurring at the same time, and then the bell ends and then the food ends. With trace conditioning, you ring the bell for a few seconds, stop ringing the bell, you have a short time delay, then you give the food, and then the food is taken away. Okay, this is called a trace interval. Trace conditioning, and the short delay between the end of the CS and the beginning of the US is what's referred to as a trace interval. The third variation of this is a long delay conditioning, very much like the short delay conditioning with a slightly longer delay. So you begin the CS and you ring it, say, for 10, 20 seconds. Then you begin the unconditioned stimulus. So you begin the food, okay, and you continue to ring the bell for another, say, 3 or 4 seconds. Then you stop with the bell and continue to leave the food there, and then eventually end the food. All right. So these are 3 variations of it. We'll actually see 2 more on the next slide. In simultaneous conditioning, as the slide indicates, you actually begin the bell and the food at the exact same time. So literally, as you're setting the food bowl down, you're ringing the bell, right? And when you go to take the food away, or when the food is done, you stop ringing the bell. So literally, they begin and end at exactly the same time. Simultaneous conditioning, as they might sound, as the name indicates. Backward conditioning is questionable, but it's a technique where essentially you give the food, right? You take the food away, you ring the bell, and then you stop ringing the bell, right? So the dog is given the food, eats the food, the bowl is removed, then the bell is rung for a little bit, and then you stop ringing the bell. So it's almost like the bell is a reward or a backward association with the unconditioned stimulus of the food. So it's unusual. This training technique doesn't work very often. It actually works in very specific circumstances, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So how do we know that classical conditioning is actually taking place? What we'll do is actually form what's a baseline, essentially, something to compare the conditioning to. So we would actually do what's referred to as a test trial. So, for example, you have a dog who you can measure the salivation of, and you ring a bell. And you sit there and ring the bell and measure how much the dog salivates. In this case, the magnitude represents the degree of salivation. And the fact that this test trial, the fact that you're presenting the CS without the US, so you're ringing the bell but not presenting any food, this is referred to as a test trial because it'll show us how much the dog salivates in response to just a bell before it is taught the value of the bell with regard to the food pairing. The probability is simply the likelihood that this response will occur. So sometimes the dog salivates at the sound of the bell, sometimes it doesn't, whatever. Basically, we're trying to see what the dog thinks of the bell prior to pairing it with the food so that we can see just the degree to which it has been conditioned. The experimental design can actually impact the pairing as well. So in a random control procedure, the control condition is presented, but the CS and US are not, right? So with regard to Pavlov's dogs, they were put in a specific device in order to measure their salivation. In this case, what they would do is actually just occasionally put them in the device and not present them with food or a bell. And what happens here is it actually makes the pairing of the two unlikely. So the dog, when it gets into the harness, won't necessarily start drooling because it's like, well, sometimes I get in the harness and I don't get anything. Other times I get in the harness and I do get something. So now they're trying to deliberately unpair or not deliberately impair, excuse me. They're trying to make sure the dog is not actually getting conditioned to the control procedure rather than the conditioned stimulus. In the explicitly impaired one, in this case, they will put the dog in the harness, either sometimes with ringing a bell or sometimes with giving the food. What they're doing is they're temporally separating the two stimuli in order to deliberately unpair the two. So this could be done to just test how the control procedures work and whether or not the dog or the subject is being conditioned for the control procedures or the actual stimuli itself. So with the excitatory conditioning that we spoke about a second ago, there's a few findings that we want to be clear of with regard to research. A delay is actually better than no delay at all. So you'd think simultaneous conditioning would actually be better for training animals. In fact, that's not true. A delay is actually helpful. So starting to ring the bell, a delay, and then presenting the food is ideal. As the next point indicates too, this is better if it's a short delay. A longer delay is not as helpful as a short delay. So ringing the bell for 3 seconds, presenting the food, continue to ring the bell and present the food for 3 seconds, and then discontinue the bell. This is going to be a good short delay. A delay is better than a trace interval as well. So we talked about trace interval being ringing the bell for 3 seconds, stopping everything, waiting 3 seconds, and then giving the food. So a delay actually is better in that it allows a more immediate association of the bell with the food. A shorter interval is better than a longer interval, and that would make sense because you ring the bell for 3 seconds and you wait for 3 seconds before giving the food, or wait for 30 seconds and bringing the food. Time can really separate the two instances from each other, so the stimuli are separate. And then, of course, the results, as I said, of backward conditioning are mixed. Occasionally it is successful, but in many instances it does not show conditioned pairing. In contrast to excitatory conditioning, inhibitory conditioning allows us to detect when there is an unconditioned aversive stimuli and how to avoid it. We'll actually spend a lot of time in the next couple of chapters talking about this as well. It shows us the absence of an unconditioned stimulus. So I never had to learn to fear a car accident. I never had to be in a car accident to know that car accidents are bad things. So there are certain stimuli that will warn me of the potential for an oncoming car accident. The example I give here is a red traffic light. When I drive, I know that that red light indicates that if I proceed, I have a high likelihood of getting into a car accident. So I stop there on the expectation that this will hopefully prevent me from getting into a car accident. This is inhibitory conditioning. The red light has inhibited me from continuing on that behavioral trajectory. Okay? And what's interesting about this, as we'll talk about in other chapters, is aversive stimuli that we can predict is not as bad as one that you cannot. So, for example, stopping at a red light, I feel very comfortable stopping at a red light, but if I was to run the red light, I know that I run a risk of a car accident, right? However, our brain really doesn't like it when you stop at a red light and still get in a car accident, because in this case, you could not foresee it coming. You have done what you're conditioned to do. You have stopped, right? And yet you still get into a car accident. So our brain responds very differently, and our emotions respond very differently when we actually have to face aversive stimuli that we did not anticipate versus aversive stimuli that we can see coming. So in contrast to excitatory conditioning, inhibition conditioning must have a presentation of the US prior to the conditioning. So in this case, the unconditioned stimulus. A car accident. I don't have to, as I said on the last slide, I don't have to have been in a car accident to understand that that's something I want to avoid, but I have to be aware of the possibility of the car accident. If I don't know why I stop at red lights, then I'd be more inclined to run a red light. I will not stop at red lights if I don't know what the consequence might look like. So an awareness of the US, in this case a presentation, prior to doing so gives me a better idea. So the absence of a car accident is noted. When I stop at a red light, I think, good, okay, I'm safe. And maybe not consciously think this, but your brain records it as, okay, we stopped at a red light and now we are safe. We stopped at a stop sign and now we are safe. We're going the speed limit and now we are safe. Our brain records these instances, and now the absence of those sort of things is reflected that way. So every time you stop at a red light and don't get to a car accident, your brain makes note of it, and you're more likely to do so in the future. Just the opposite is true, unfortunately. Every time you run a red light and don't get to a car accident, it increases the likelihood of you disobeying the inhibition procedures. So we'll explore this idea a bit further as we move through the topic of aversion. Sometimes with inhibition, we understand that a complete absence of a certain stimuli, a safety stimuli, there is a greater chance of a diversive outcome. So, for example, a child that gets bullied at school understands that if he's left alone, if he's not supervised by a teacher or another school administrator, that there's a good chance that he will be picked on. So these people represent a safety signal or a positive sign of safety in this case. So the absence of this individual or these individuals indicates a strong prevalence of the unconditioned stimulus, in this case the pain of being bullied or what have you like this. So some things act strictly as safety measures overall and signs of comfort. If you know anything about agoraphobia, the being at home is the sign stimulus for safety, or being around a certain person is a sign stimulus for safety. Often people, when they're experiencing treatment for agoraphobia, will have a safe person, or you can actually get an assistance dog that is a safety dog. This becomes a sign, a safety sign or a sign stimuli that indicates that you are safe. So this helps them to leave the home and engage in a larger world because they take that sign, that safety sign with them. Inhibition and aversion in general can be tested in a variety of ways, one of which is the bidirectional response system. In this case, you actually increase or decrease the conditioned stimuli depending on a variety of factors. The example your textbook uses is a rat who pushes a lever and then is either given a food pellet or given a shock. This can actually measure how much they will produce inhibition, and it becomes essentially a consequence weighing situation, a cost-benefit analysis. The rat knows, okay, if I push the lever, I might get a food pellet, which is very good, or if I push the lever, I might actually get a shock, which is very bad. In either case, it is going to get something. What the rat needs to do, essentially, is weigh the consequences. Does the shock outweigh the food pellet? And based on that sort of judgment, the rat will either choose to continue to push the lever or to abandon that behavior. And it's interesting because I think human beings, we do this as well. As a student, you can choose to go to class or you can choose to stay home and watch Netflix. In either case, there is a cost or consequence. But given the choice behavior, we can see how much we are inhibited from doing one thing or excited towards doing another. In some situations, a compound stimulus or a summation test is required to really test how much inhibition has been learned. For example, if you see two cars that have collided, right? You see a car accident and you look and it was at a red light, that one of the cars ran the red light and has caused the car accident, right? We might understand that, okay, well, maybe running a red light is a bad idea. However, we could be even more conditioned towards that red light if we then see two cars stop at a red light and avoid a collision. So in this case, we're being shown the negative outcome of not heeding the inhibition, and we can also see the positive outcome of heeding the inhibition. So it's kind of a two-pronged effect. You not only see what the negative outcome would be if you do not follow your conditioning, and you also see what the positive outcome will look like if you do follow your conditioning. And this is a good way to both train and then assess inhibition very quickly. For example, a parent could do this. If a child refuses to listen to not touch the stove when it's hot, the parent might let the child touch the stove briefly so that they can see what happens when you avoid that conditioning. So they actually see the negative outcome, and in the future, when they know it's hot and don't touch it, they realize they won't get burned. So this compound stimulus or this summation test allows you to see how strong the inhibition is and how much conditioning is actually taking place. And as I said before, conditioning, classical conditioning, is everywhere around us. It's not just for Pavlov and his dogs. This is a human nature at its essence. Things like we talked about, food preference and aversion. I include Gatorade on this slide. Anytime you have a stomach virus, I know with me, anytime I ever have a stomach virus, I drink a lot of Gatorade because it helps me replenish and stay hydrated. But I refuse to drink Gatorade when I'm not sick. I now have an aversion of Gatorade to Gatorade because the idea of drinking Gatorade makes me associate it with being ill, so I will only drink it when I'm sick. Fear, the development of fear too. We learn to fear from certain animals, snakes and things like this, depending on different experiences. Drug addiction and tolerance is something we'll talk about in another chapter, but this is very much an act of classical conditioning. And it's got sexual situations, sexual/romantic situations. It could be even relationships. There's a lot of conditioning that we associate with certain things and negative things. Things that draw us towards an individual or push us away from the individual. Things that we find attractive or things that we don't find attractive. So we'll talk about more how conditioning can affect our day-to-day lives as we move through these subsequent chapters.